Hey, what's going on, Freedom Ninjas? It's Jeff King here, and this is The Thing with King. Today we're going to talk about education and adulthood in a voluntary society, but before we get started with this talk, please remember, hit that subscribe button. The political construct of adulthood is not only an artificial mandate forced onto society by politicians, it's also a mandate that's detrimental to our youth. As things stand, adulthood is granted to each of us as if by magic when we turn 18. One second you can't enjoy a cigarette and an exotic dancer. The next second you're magically adult enough to get sent off to Iraq to get your leg blown off in the defense of, let's be honest, politicians asserting their dominance over society. I think we used to call those people warlords. In America and most of the world, we have adulthood completely wrong, and we need to get politicians out of our children's lives. Individuals ought to view adulthood as the willingness and ability to own complete control over one's actions and the resulting consequences, instead of an age-dependent political declaration. Now look, age correlates with a person's maturity. I'm not naive enough to believe otherwise, but it's not the defining feature of adulthood. If a person has the proven ability and willingness to provide for their livelihood, take responsibility for their actions, negotiate contracts, and maintain relationships, then should it matter if they reach the age of 18? These are characteristics of someone who is capable of self-determination, and their freedom shouldn't be limited by arbitrary political law. Society should be encouraging teenagers to take steps towards accountability, responsibility, and independence. Instead, the American educational system strips young people of their autonomy and infantilizes our youth. Instead of young people being free to develop their passions and pursue their economic and personal interests, they are forcibly herded into government educational compounds. Should a 15-year-old happen to be a phenomenal painter, well, he isn't free to work on his craft all day, find a mentor in the industry, develop a website, bargain with his showroom, and market his work to willing customers. No. Instead, he is forcibly confined in the governmental education complex with thousands of other young people who likewise have been denied the cognitive pleasure of finding their calling, working with adults, and developing their marketable talents. If a young person at the age of 16 wants to attend medical school and there is a school willing to educate him, then what business is it of the government to tell a fully cognizant human being they aren't allowed to choose their direction in life? Every single person, regardless of age, is maturing at a different pace and for different reasons. Mandating a one-size-fits-all stamp on America's youth stifles their progress and relegates young people to being physically and intellectually trapped by random political mandates. It's time we realize that coercing our youth into classrooms where they are forced to socialize with other confined youth serves to stunt a young person's intellectual and societal growth. Teenagers should be learning how to become adults by interacting on equal and professional foundation with adults, not being their serfs in classroom. If one cares about our youth and society's ability to produce young, flourishing adults, then we must move towards ending government's monopoly on adulthood and education. Monopolies that are created and protected by government rarely satisfy customer needs or advance human well-being. If there was ever a sector of the economy which should not be monopolized, and which should be subject to the customer satisfaction profit motive, it's education. Our youth deserve teachers, administrators, and business professionals focused on customer satisfaction instead of bureaucrats advancing political directives. Also, what values are subliminally taught to our young when they are sent to monopolistic governmental schools? When our young are just starting to form their understanding of the world and build lifelong values which will guide them as adults, they are sent to learn values prescribed by government. Now, do we ever ask ourselves if governmental values match our own, and if governmental values are going to foster more or less peaceful adults in society? And I think there's a stark contrast between governmental values and your personal values. Our daily values are such that we avoid creating violent interactions with others and seek to resolve disputes through voluntary manners. The values of government are to meet disputes with threats of violence, and when disputes aren't solved by the earlier threats of violence, politicians respond with greater levels of violence. This cycle of political values has resulted in wars that slaughter millions. Values so ingrained into the existence of government that America has been at war for 220 out of its last 242-year existence. Individuals outside of government use ethical standards of voluntarism and value creation to generate income, while governments use values of coercion and theft backed by gun violence to generate income. I think you government apologists call this theft Taxes? Governments mandate loyalty and devotion by virtue of one being born in a political territory. Individuals earn and acquire loyalty by being persons of virtue and trustworthiness. The values of a successful government are built upon gun violence, coercion, and submission, whereas the values of a successful individual are built upon respect, persuasion, and trade. Governmental values do not square with our own. So why do we send our youth to institutions which are built upon ethics of coercion and submission? Institutions which are funded by theft backed by gun violence. Institutions which teach our youth to surrender their autonomy to politicians, and then politicians take their autonomy and send youth to wars which have resulted in the deaths of hundreds of millions. And progressives think corporations are evil and will enslave society? Have you ever heard of the draft? The draft, that's politician speak for slavery. Corporations enslaving society. I remember that one time a Hewlett-Packard CEO started a war, used jails and the threat of gun violence to force young men to participate in a war that killed tens of millions of young men, said no one ever. Can anything be more obvious than the fact that progressives are as regressive as a pager? There is nothing progressive about advocating to give a third party more control over your life. Bring back the monarchy. That should be the chant of regressive. Anyways, we are failing the next generation by stripping them of the freedom to find their passions of life on their own schedule, free from political mandates, and we are failing them by forcing them into 8-hour regimented school days. Our youth deserve more. We need to free our youth from governmental education and from politically prescribed adulthood. So the question then is, well, how would adulthood work in a free society? Now, it's hard to say exactly how adulthood would work in a free society because I don't know everything. No one does. And that's exactly why we should be free from politicians, by the way. They don't know everything, which is why they shouldn't have the power to control everything. But I digress. One thing that we can assume is that adulthood would be more of an evolution, as opposed to a magical political declaration. You and everyone else over time would build a reputation of being a person worth doing business with, and therefore others would feel comfortable doing business with you. So what do I mean by doing business? Well, most transactions and agreements in life are a form of doing business, even if you don't realize it. Buying a car is a business transaction, not just a purchase. Agreeing to work for someone else is a business transaction. Getting a credit card is a business transaction. All of these examples involve contracts, and in a free world, one would have to be deemed responsible and trustworthy enough to enter into a contract. But what do I mean by responsible enough? Well, the level of responsibility and good character necessary to enter into a contract with another person will vary depending on the subjective or objective value assigned to the contract by the two parties involved. An employer may not require much work history or proof of past accomplishments if you're going to be a bagger at a grocery store. But if you're going to be, let's say, the accountant at the grocery store, then they may require proof of accounting proficiency and proof you are an honest person. And how you go about providing the proof demanded will be up to you two to decide. Adulthood would be an evolution. So here's an example of how that evolution can play out. If you're 14 years old and you want to get a job, an employer might ask you what experience you have. You might not have any work experience, but what you should have are grades. Grades are, in a very real sense, a reflection of one's ability to show up on time, do the work that is prescribed, and grades are a reflection of how well you did the work prescribed. Your future employer will look at your grades as your potential work worthiness, as they do today, and the employer may or may not hire you. From that point on, your grades and new employer would be a reference for your next job or college application, and you would start to build a reputation as being a person adult enough to be responsible for your own actions. In a free world, you simply don't become an adult. You gradually build a resume of work experience, and you build relationships with others to certify your honesty in keeping your promises. A free society will encourage the evolution of values of human respect, as individuals will no longer be viewed as adult because they have reached a politically mandated adulthood metric. Rather, adulthood would be viewed as the ability to use one's free will in an effort to make their lives and other people's lives around them better. Individuals who display the adult characteristics of honesty, integrity, and accountability, individuals who are just plain kind and trustworthy, would be far more likely to be a success in life because in society, and especially in a free world, most people do not want to do business with an untrustworthy, dishonest, unaccountable individual. In a culture where adulthood has to be more or less earned through a history of one's interactions with others, we would all be sure to try to be nice, decent human beings. Getting rid of the political mandate on adulthood will also act to keep our young safer. Today, if a young person is being abused or neglected by their parents, Most people look to the state to save the young person from the horrible situation they are in. If a young person is lucky in today's coercive governmental world, a family member may be able to step in and help take the young person from their parents and get governmental permission to keep the young person. If the state takes the young person, they are thrown into the governmental foster system, a system full of fraud, abuse, and rape. In today's world, a young person is dependent on the goodwill of others for help. In a free world, a young person can still rely on the goodwill of others, but they will also have the ability to just walk away from the situation and no one would have the legal ability to stop them. A young person who's being abused or neglected can simply walk away from their parents and find any number of ways to sustain themselves. And we can go through a list of ways in which a young person can help themselves. For starters, they can go stay with a family member. And if they do so under their own free will, then the parents will have no legal recourse against the young person's decisions, as all humans will have the freedom to associate with whomever they choose. Of course, within reason. A 3-year-old isn't going to go build a diaper statue and go torch it at Burning Man. The young person can contact a charity that specializes in helping young people to escape their violent situations. The young person, if capable, can simply leave the house, get a job, rent an apartment, and leave the violent parents forever. The young person can contact their local security agency and explain the situation to them, and if the young person is deemed either cognizant enough to make their own decisions or provides proof of neglect, the security agency can help the young person find a charity willing to help them or a family willing to adopt the young person. In a free world, the option to help young people will still be there with the added benefit of young persons having the ability to help themselves. Now, what would happen if a young person leaves their parents and takes shelter at an agency that helps victimize young people and the parents want their offspring back? The parents wanting their child back would go to the shelter and ask for their child back. And if the shelter refuses for the child's own protection, then the parents will go to a local common law judge to have the pending case arbitrated. The judge, and maybe even a jury, will hear the testimony from the young person and the parents. In a free world, a 14-year-old who is capable of making their own decisions would simply have to prove that they are fully cognizant human beings, aware of their decision to leave the family household, and the judge can't stop the young person. Now, if the case involves someone a little younger, let's say a 9-year-old, then the burden of responsibility would be on the young person to prove they are capable of making their own decisions. And we can assume most 9-year-olds are not mature enough to make that large of a decision. But if the 9-year-old and others can prove the 9-year-old is being neglected, then a judge seeing the wishes of the young person and the evidence proving the neglect may rule in the young person's favor of leaving the parents. But what about a case where a 9-year-old who has loving parents and is not being neglected just runs away to the local shelter and says they are being neglected or abused? Well, we can safely assume that the shelter would call the parents and talk to them and assess the situation. It's important to remember, in a free world, organizations, including children's shelters, will be funded voluntarily, not through coercion and governmental gun violence. Shelters designed to help young people will have to petition to society at large for donations to help young people. In order to actually receive donations from the public, they will have to make sure they do what they promised: help young people, not steal rebellious young people from their parents. It's safe to assume that the majority of shelters will be working to earn their donations so they don't go out of business. Now ask yourself this: who are you going to give money to? A shelter that discloses how many children they've held and are open with how they spend their money? Or a shelter which discloses nothing? Shelters will be far more focused on helping young people and far more accountable than the broken, coercive foster system. Eliminating political adulthood will also work to make better parents. A free society absent government will incentivize parents to not be lazy bums who mildly neglect their offspring. A person at the age of 13 or 14 or 15 can simply walk out as they are not the property of the parents. Knowing that young people have the freedom to decide their own destiny in life, most parents will need to be more cognizant of their parenting and how they interact with their offspring. The drunk father who verbally or physically abuses his children or mother will quickly find his household empty. The prostituting mother who invites dangerous and violent men into their house may find the house empty when she isn't busy entertaining paid guests. Young people having the freedom to protect themselves from lazy, violent, and neglectful parents will naturally make parents more cautious with their parenting and foster stronger parent-child relationships. In a world without government and the idiotic political mandate of adulthood, young people will be more free to protect themselves and society would be better off. Government is coercion backed by gun violence. Society will never reach its potential so long as we have one group of people pointing guns at another and forcing them to live according to the gun pointer's rules. Doesn't matter if the people pointing the guns are called government. Violence and coercion will eventually destroy a once peaceful and prosperous people. And that's the thing with King.